Greetings, everyone. This is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and today's video is going to be a continuation of the previous video I did concerning disproving the virgin birth, but this time I'm going to be talking about the truth about the Septuagint or the LXX. So to get into this video, I'm going to kind of rush through it a little bit because I think I want to let the information that I'll be presenting in it speak for itself. So I'm just going to kind of like gloss over what's actually there. And there are two main elements of this video that I'll be discussing. And the first one's concerning the missionaries' claim that the text modernly known as the Septuagint, was translated by Jews slash rabbis. The second thing I want to be basically dealing with is concerning the issue of missionaries who also claim that the virgin birth described in the Greek New Testament is supported by the Greek Septuagint. Septuagint, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that word. I always have problems with certain Greek words. So, to basically jump off, I'm going to start with a Jewish position on this topic because one of the things I've noticed that when you look up this topic concerning the Septuagint and its history, you usually find a lot of, I would say, like Christianized histories about it, but very little information that actually comes from a Jewish perspective on it. So at Chabad.org, they have a good article about this, and I'll probably be putting a link in the description so a person can read the whole article because I'm only giving certain snippets of it. But essentially, what it describes is, in the first part, as you see, the history of the actual text itself, what the name is and what Jews actually called it. Actually, the term Septuagint is actually not the term used by Jews to describe a Greek translation of the Torah. And that's a very important point. The story that you've probably heard about the Septuagint is actually a story or a tale or a legend about how the first Jewish translation was made of the five books of Moses, the Torah itself, but not any of the other books. And at that time, it was called the Targum HaShivaim, meaning the translation of 70. Now, the article continues and says, something really interesting. And it notes in the highlighted, it says, it should be noted that the Greek text referred to as the Septuagint, meaning modernly, which is called the Septuagint and has been throughout most of, Christian use of the term, is not the same text produced by the rabbis in Egypt, as we shall soon see. So this article basically, in the part I didn't include here, goes through and explains exactly the Jewish history of the text. And one of the things they show in conclusion is that this, concerning the Septuagint, is reading the above story, the information that I did include, but you can find it on the link that I'll be providing. We learn that the sages only transmitted the five books of Moses into Greek, meaning they only did the Torah. The books of, like, for example, Yeshayahu, Isaiah, or anything, the prophetic books, were not translated as a part of that particular story about the king of Egypt, Ptolemy, basically requesting a translation. He only requested the Torah according to the story, so it was only of the five books of Moses and nothing else. And it says they made specific tweaks, which are clearly listed, meaning in the Talmud it actually describes what tweaks they made in the translation in order for the Hebrew to not be misunderstood to mean something else because of how the differences between Greek and Hebrew is linguistically in terms of its grammar. So the Talmud records all of these things. And then they bring a very interesting point when they say that thus they were not the authors of the work today known as the Septuagint, meaning that the Jews who did the translation that's described in this history from the king of Ptolemy did not translate what is known today as the Septuagint. Okay, and it says that, which, contains the entire, like, Tanakh, for example, as well as the Apocrypha. And it does not contain the specific changes listed in the Talmud. So what this means is that a person has to differentiate here that when people talk about the Septuagint nowadays, especially when people are talking about it in the Christian sense, what they're talking about is translations made by later Christians and not made by the Jews according to the original story. Especially not of the prophetic books. Now it's not impossible that certain parts of the Torah portion of the Septuagint may have been copies of copies of copies, and then later translated, for example, of something that may have been in the original, but nobody can show you the original. So, for example, nobody can show you, according to the story, the original text that the 70 or 72, rabbis or elders of, the Jewish people who were described in the story, nobody can show you an autographed copy of, like, one of the translations they made. Nobody can show you that. Everything that's claimed today is not something that is proven to be produced by them. And the information that follows will show that. So one of the important elements is that one of the mistakes that some people make with this topic is that they think, excuse me, that the Septuagint was made because of the fact that Jews around the world didn't understand Hebrew or Aramaic, and that they understood Greek. When in reality, there are only certain locations where Jews spoke, Greek, and that Greek was called Judeo-Greek. It was a type of mixture between Hebrew and Greek, or some people call it the Yabbanit Yehudit. And that was only spoken and used in certain language, certain areas, certain regions. So, for example, during the Macedonian Empire, the Seleucid Empire, that was something that was used by Jews in those regions. But many times, for example, a Jew, might have something that's in the Greek language mixed with Hebrew statements and words, but it's written in, a type of Hebrew. For example, so it'd be written in Hebrew letters. And if you look at the estimated number of speakers, like, for example, in 1900 versus in 2023, you'll see that very few Jews, even modernly, have used this language. And usually it's only Jews who came from like areas like Greece, for example. And most of them, nowadays be found in Israel. But if you can, consider how many Jews historically were speaking Aramaic, for example, as a as a vocal language, as a spoken language, you find way more locations, where this language is used and way more names for it and way more dialects for it. So you can see that there were a lot more Jews, speaking Aramaic as a spoken language. And even today, you find way more. So this helps prove this point that, for example, the claim about the Septuagint being something that, as if it was like needed by the Jewish community because we didn't understand, Jews at that time didn't understand Hebrew or Aramaic. If that was the case, you'd have way more Jews who still use and understand Greek when you have fewer. So 1900, for example, in terms of different forms of Aramaic, different dialects of Aramaic, you have 15,000 Jews estimated as being able to speak it. And in 2023, you have an estimate of about 20,000 versus the low numbers you see, with the Greek, for example, of, like 6,000 in 1900 and 80 in 2023. So it's considered virtually extinct, where, the spoken Aramaic is considered in danger because of the fact that Jews have returned to speaking Hebrew again. So there's an interesting article I found concerning six interesting facts about the Septuagint. And again, it is, I think it's more, I think the guy who wrote it is more of coming from a Christian perspective. And if you see in the highlighted again, it stresses the fact that the translation was only of the Torah, and it was done, like in the third century, BCE. Um, and the other thing he mentions about it, and I'm kind of jumping around the article, is the primary edition of the Septuagint used today is the Raushanhart, I hope I said that correctly, edition, which is kind of eclectic, meaning that a lot of the texts that are nowadays called Septuagint are kind of a mixture of text of different Christian codices that were made over the number of years. But this is in no way the original one, that's claimed in the tale of the legend about the one that Ptolemy asked for. So going a little bit further in the first thing of the six interesting facts, he says there was no official Septuagint in Judaism or in the early church. While there might well have been an effort to translate the Torah, the Hebrew Torah into Greek with the Ptolemaic patronage in third century Alexandria, there was no standard Greek text of the Tanakh, or he says the Old Testament. And also, but there was no control over the translations. Some of these translations were literal, others were paraphrastic, and some were even speculative when the Greek translator was simply guessing what a Hebrew word meant. And this is especially with animals, musical instruments, and people's names. What emerged was a number of Greek translations of Hebrew books, which we call the OG or the Old Greek. Okay, so that's an important point to make. He further says Christians eventually became the main consumers and users of the Septuagint and had a propensity to Christianize it to suit their theological interest. It is hardly surprising that the primary textual witnesses of the Septuagint are the 4th and 5th century codices, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, and Codex Alexandrinus. So this is an important point. I mean, you can keep reading, a little bit more about this, but this shows what I'm saying concerning this idea that some people have that, that basically when Jews, concerning this issue of like the virgin birth and all that, that there's a different text that we're using in Hebrew, and that the Greek is superior, or that the Greek answers the question of why, this idea of a virgin birth, makes sense when in reality it doesn't, according to both the Hebrew and even the Greek, as I'll show in just a second. So concerning the issue of the manuscripts, you can look at Wikipedia, and they have some mentions here of what actual fragments exist, from what periods. So, for example, they have like a fragment of a page of Greek translation from the second century BC. Now they claim it's the Septuagint, but it's again the Septuagint was a Christianized name. It's not something that Jews called this translation, for example. And not only that, there's no evidence that this fragment that they're talking about actually came from the time period or was one of the translations from the story of Ptolemy. And it says also relatively complete manuscripts of the Septuagint post-date the Hexaplar recension and include the 4th century AD, AD or CE, Codex Vaticanus, and the 5th century Codex Alexandrinus. These are the oldest surviving nearly complete manuscripts of the basically of the Tanakh. But essentially, this is something that is, it says here that the oldest forms of the Torah that they claim to be the Septuagint, from these fragments. But again, there's no evidence that those fragments were the ones translated by Jews. Okay, so the question then is, what does this mean? What this means is that the original Jewish translation of the Torah into Greek no longer exist, i.e., no one can prove that they have a copy of the one from the legend slash tale. So what this would mean is that no one can pull out, a fragment of, or even a full text, and say this one comes from those 70 rabbis that translated from, from Hebrew into Greek, and it has their names on it. Here, are the names. Nobody can show you a text like that. If somebody did, they'd be very rich, and it would be the talk of the town if that exact something like that actually existed, but it doesn't. So there's an article I found from the Society of Biblical Literature that actually talks about this issue, where they quote the book, a particular work, which was something that was written by a guy named Richard R. Oatley, and he says the following in the part here. He says, in Isaiah, I find it hard to see that the Septuagint gives any proof at all, unless a few isolated exceptions, of an older or superior Hebrew text. Because the translators seem to have been so constantly mistaken in reading their Hebrew, or unable to translate it, as to deprive their witnesses of all authority. Seldom, if ever, is it reading intrinsically preferable to the Masoretic text. So what this means is this: there are some people who claim that the Septuagint, as they have it, references or it was translated from an older Hebrew text, which was superior to the Masoretic text. And he says that there's no evidence of that. He says there's no evidence at all of that. And in fact, that there's evidence that whoever translated what is currently considered to be Septuagint, was mistaken in reading their Hebrew or unable to translate it, meaning that someone's kind of said, okay, I'll have to assume that this is what this means. And this article goes a little bit further and kind of gets into others who have the same, view, for example, and also how to look at it. And, you can pause here and take a read of this. I kind of just took different pieces of it from their article, and you can find the reference online because it's, it's something I found online. And it talks about some of these issues concerning whoever translated and, the idea that they had confusion about how to translate the text into Greek. So then, another issue is the Greek word that missionaries claim is virgin in the Septuagint does not mean virgin in the way that they claim. So in order to understand this particular point, you have to remember that if you look at the previous video I showed, that the word used in the Hebrew text of Yeshayahu, of Isaiah 7, I think it's like 7:14, is Alma. And Alma does not mean virgin. It just means young girl, with no distinction. But it's clear from the text that it's not talking about a virgin, and therefore there is no thing that somebody can pull out that, oh, well, this is, talking about a virgin in the future. I talked about that in the previous video, why that was, a problem, and how it didn't make any sense. So let's look and see, okay, well, if this claim that some people have, that there's a Greek word in the Septuagint that actually means virgin, and therefore, because somebody wants to say that the book of Matthew is talking about a virgin, I think Luke also, that's superior to the Hebrew text that exists, let's take a look and see what that means. So I found in this interesting article from Abiurim Publications. Abiurim Publications Biblical Dictionary, the New Testament Greek word for Parthenos. So Parthenos is this word that there are certain, missionaries who claim it means virgin, and that therefore it's like, what is actually being referenced in the New Testament. But I found this article that talks about the word and says that the word doesn't mean virgin the way that people try to understand it modernly, and that the word virgin itself means something different. So it says here, the noun parthenos means virgin and has nothing to do with a lack of sexual experience or physical intercourse. Our English word virgin comes from the Latin word virgo, which either derives from or it shares its roots with virgo, which describes a fresh branch or a plant of it or a tree. A Virgo was a girl who still lived with her parents instead of with her husband. Since in antiquity sexual intercourse commonly resulted in pregnancy, and thus the decade and a half costly care for a child, no parent would allow their daughter to be impregnated by someone who didn't sign up for the duration. And lastly, this was an economic consideration, not a sexual or moral one. So let's go a little bit further. The article goes into some other issues here and says, in the Christian era, Matthew's quote of Isaiah's famous statement allowed for the revival of the mother goddess cult. but neither Joseph nor anybody in the original audience of the gospel would have missed the obvious reference to Pallas Athena, whose famous epithet of Parthenos. Now he goes in further and says the noun parthenia, meaning virginity, again, not denoting sexual innocence, but rather the period of a girl's life spent with her parents. This word occurs in Luke 2:36, only applied to Anna, the prophetess, which is again a reference to Athens, or rather the council of wise men whose governance of the people had quickly failed, but whose legacy had always remained faithful to the greater universal truths. And this is also backed up. This isn't something that's only like on one site concerning the word parthenos. It says, here, in fact, from this Turning to God's Word site, it says, in fact, that in Greek literature, there are numerous uses of this word going all the way back to Homer to refer to a young woman who are decidedly are not virgins. The possible meaning virgin develops because young women were assumed to be chaste, but chastity is not an essential characteristic of this concept. So this proves the point very well that, when looking at this idea that, Jesus was born of a virgin birth, it's not supported by the Torah in Hebrew, and it's not even supported like in, the Christianized translations of the, into Greek, which that now are being called Septuagint. So if we go back and look and say, okay, let's look at the Dead Sea Scroll. There's the Great Isaiah Scroll, which is, I think for the moment, is currently the oldest complete text of Yeshayahu, of Isaiah, in Hebrew. And it's mostly complete. There's some areas of it that are torn that you can see here in different areas. But concerning this issue, if we look at the online site, and when we look and say, someone can say, well, you guys are just translating Alma as a young woman when it should be virgin. You're translating incorrectly. You Jews don't know Hebrew. You don't know anything. Only we know it, better than you do. So if you look at the translation that even shows up online, in the area where you would have the word Alma, it says, look, the young woman has conceived and is bearing a son. And then his name will be Emmanuel. So if we look, and that's in this area of the Dead Sea Scroll. So we look in this area here, this right here, in this section here in red, where you see my arrows coming down. This is the word ha'alma, and ha'alma with the green area here. This is the hay in that form. That the particular scribe who wrote this, he wrote his hays in a very interesting way, and you'd have to basically know, how he was writing to kind of understand it. But this is hay. Ain, Lamed, Mem, He. So, Ho, Al, Mo. Now, you would think, because this is not a Masoretic text, this is pre-Masoretic, and Masoretic only means that there are vowel points in also grammar, written grammar notations and written vowel points into the text. This text predates the creation of those symbols to represent vowels. So it's like pre the use of of like symbols to do vowels as well as grammar. So this means that this is a pre-Masoretic text and it's not even a Masoretic text, and it matches the Masoretic text by saying ho almo. So this goes to what I was saying earlier, that Alma means, a young woman, and it has no connection to her being a virgin. The word batula, if that was the intent, would have been used here rather than Alma, because it would have made it 100% clear of what's being talked about. And even still, when you look at the context, like I mentioned in the previous video, that this was a sign for King Ahaz. And Ahaz, sorry, lived during a time where if someone had told him that, this virgin will give birth as a sign, that wouldn't have made sense to him, because that's not a sign of anything, and essentially it says here, hara, which means that she was already pregnant when this is being said. So, the context is very clear that it's meaning that there's a young woman here that's pregnant and she's going to give birth at some point, and she's going to name the son Emmanuel, and then certain events are going to happen, and before the child gets to a certain point of its life or a certain age, then these enemy armies that are invading are not going to, afflict Ahaz, because that's what he was worried about. That anything else would have been meaningless to him. Especially if you say, well, I'm not talking about this girl here, I'm talking about some girl in the future, who's going to do something. So essentially, this is like, the breakdown of how this works, and this is where I say that, it's pretty clear when you look at the Hebrew and when you look at the original text and look at the history, even of the other claims that are made by missionaries, they don't make sense. So this is a Hav Ever from the Chronicles of a Hav Ever, and I might do one more video on this topic and then close out. Thank you and bye.